order. Bambus Charalumbus to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I beg to move that this House has considered debt cancellation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a momentous campaign, the Jubilee 2000 Debt Campaign, which brought together people from all walks of life, of trade unions, churches, community groups, and even the odd rock star and celebrity, with the sole purpose of demanding debt relief for the world's poorest countries who are suffering extreme poverty caused by debt payments. The campaign was a resounding success and resulted in over $130 billion of debt cancellation for 36 low-income countries, equating on average to a 75% debt reduction for each country, allowing them to invest in health and education systems and other public services. While the Jubilee 2000 campaign was widely celebrated and world leaders felt some good had been achieved, it later became clear that the symptom had been dealt with, but not the cause. The current state of affairs is alarming. The World Bank, in their latest international debt report, stated that developing countries spent a record $1.4 trillion to service foreign debts. Interest payments alone soared by nearly a third to $406 billion, leaving many developing countries having to cut vital services such as health, education, and also on the environment. The pressures were felt most greatly by the poorest and most vulnerable countries, who paid a record $96.2 billion to service their debt in 2023. And of that, $34.6 billion was in interest alone, a staggering fourfold increase than a decade ago. Indemit Gill, the World Bank Group's chief economist, said, "In highly indebted poor countries, multilateral development banks are now acting as a lender of last resort, a role they were not designed to serve. That reflects a dysfunctional financing system." According to CAFOD's recently published report on global debt crisis, 3.3 billion people now live in countries who spend more on debt servicing than they do on health, education, and with most food insecure countries being the highest increases. Debt servicing is expected to consume 55% of low-income countries' budgets in sub-Saharan Africa by 2025. A definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And when countries like Ghana and Sri Lanka end up having to receive a 17th IMF bailout package, it's clear that things have to change. A complicating factor in dealing with debt relief is the role of private creditors. Since the success of Jubilee 2000 campaign, private creditors have exploded onto the international debt scene. Today, 61% of global sovereign debt is owed to private creditors, such as hedge funds, asset managers, and investment banks. The terms and conditions of private lenders are often far more onerous than those of multilateral lenders, leaving low-income countries at the mercy of exorbitant interest rates and quick repayment schemes. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and also for the work that he has long done in this incredibly important area. And he has talked about the impact of rising interest rates on low-income countries. If you add to that the impact of COVID and also the impact of dealing with climate change, does he agree with me specifically that, and he's talking about the private sector operators, but that when countries like the UK choose to forgive sovereign debt, speculators and private sector operators should not be in a position to profit from it, but should follow the country's lead?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. It's something I'll come on to later on in my speech, but she's absolutely right. We need to treat private creditors in the same way as bilateral and multilateral creditors. So these private credit schemes are proving to be very lucrative deals for private creditors. In 2023 alone, private creditors received $68 billion more in interest and repayments from low-income countries than they had actually lent to them. That in itself is bad enough, but what is worse is that when a defaulting country is seeking debt relief, there is nothing to compel private creditors to agree to be bound by any agreement reached by multilateral and bilateral creditors. In fact, there's no obligation to compel them to act in good faith or at all. One stark example of this is the case of Sri Lanka. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its sovereign debt, which led to the most serious economic crisis in the country's history. Sri Lanka sought debt relief from its creditors, 47% of which was owned by private creditors. Despite reaching an agreement with its bilateral creditors, the private creditors refused to accept any debt relief and sued Sri Lanka in the US courts to prioritise their debts. As a result, the private creditors will receive 30% more in debt repayment than the bilateral creditors, while Sri Lanka had to seek a bailout from the IMF. As a result, Sri Lanka would have to slash its public sector spending and spend 30% of its government revenue to go towards debt repayments, which the IMF regards as unsustainable. It is morally repugnant that private creditors behave in this way, deliberately hampering the ability of a low-income country to get back on its feet at a time of crisis. But Sri Lanka is not alone in this experience at the hands of private lenders. Following the COVID pandemic, realising that international debt needed to be urgently dealt with, the G20 set up its common framework for debt treatments as the main global framework for dealing with resolving debt crises. The expectation was that all creditors would cooperate in collectively agreeing debt relief for countries who sought relief under this framework. Despite progress being made with bilateral and multilateral creditors, Chad and Zambia, who were both seeking debt relief under the framework, found that their private creditors would either drag negotiations out or offer debt relief that was significantly less than what was agreed with the bilateral or multilateral creditors. Chad failed to get any debt relief from its main private creditor, the UK-based company Glencore, while Glencore will be repaid 50% more than government creditors. Zambia had been negotiating a debt relief agreement for over 4 years. When it finally reached agreement with the bondholders, one of the private companies was paid 13% more than governments, including the UK, while other private lenders, including UK-based Standard Chartered and Investec, are still to agree debt relief with Zambia. Ethiopia and Ghana are also experienced similar behaviour from private creditors. This behaviour from private creditors is contrary to the spirit of the framework and has resulted in a loss of confidence in the framework's efficacy from other debtor countries. To date, only 4 countries have sought relief under the framework. The truth is that private creditors have no incentive to agree to debt relief because if they hold out, they get the interest payments and principal repayments as agreed. And if there is a default, then they can sue for enforcement action in the UK or US courts against the defaulting country, which will also work out to be lucrative for them. For private creditors, it's a win-win situation. For low-income countries, it's lose-lose. Expecting the private creditors to voluntarily enter into debt relief arrangements is like telling an alcoholic not to have a drink. Urgent legislation is required to compel private creditors to enter into and be bound by debt relief agreements. We've talked a lot about sums of money so far, but we must remember that the human cost of investment not going to low-income countries as a result of debt-free servicing. For example, the rise of infant mortality due to cuts in health spending. UNICEF has stated that if a country has defaulted in debt repayments which remain unresolved over 3 years, that infant mortality level rises 11.4% over that same period. Chronic underinvestment in education leads to a less skilled, less healthy and less productive workforce, resulting in a lost generation, making it harder for them to escape poverty. So what needs to be done to resolve the debt crises? In their excellent 2023 report on debt relief in low-income countries, the International Development Committee came up with some recommendations. First, reform of the governance of financial institutions who control international debt, such as the IMF, would be one such measure. The conditions imposed by the IMF on debt bailout often have dire effects and make things worse for the debtor country by placing more emphasis on short-term repayment of debt rather than on long-term infrastructure development of a country's needs that provide it with lasting security and protection from indebtedness. Secondly, creating a level playing field by passing legislation to compel private creditors to actively participate in the debt relief process by preventing them from suing for money they would get if they accepted debt relief on the same terms as other lenders. In 2010, the Labour government passed the Debt Relief Developing Countries Act, which did exactly that for debt that was owed prior to 2004. My 10-minute rule bill is an updated version of the 2010 Act. Since over 90% of bonds owed by countries eligible for debt relief are issued in the UK, this would have a significant impact on those low-income countries and could be transformative in allowing money spent on servicing debt to go into health and education systems and to be spent on the environment. It would cost the Treasury nothing, and at a time when aid spending is seeing very little, if any, increase, then this will be a sure way of getting money to the most vulnerable countries. There is no justification for treating private creditors differently from other lenders. Thirdly, there needs to be a public global debt register to record details of all global sovereign debt. The need for transparency is urgent and would help populations in debtor countries hold their governments to account over entering agreements with predatory private creditors. Fourthly, there should be a framework for automatic cancellation of debt servicing where highly indebted countries are hit by catastrophic events such as climate-related disasters, for example, like Storm Beryl. It cannot be right that whilst a climate-vulnerable country is struggling to get back on its feet, that it's being forced to make debt servicing payments. Instead of making them apply for debt cancellation, the international institutions, debt cancellation should be automatic. At a time when the total external debt serviced by all African countries in 2024 was 104 billion, of which 47 billion is owed to private creditors, and where the entire UK aid budget to Africa in 2024 was £993 million, something needs to change, otherwise we're just servicing the debt owed to private creditors. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and his generosity, as well as the excellent points he is making. As the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Africa, and I've noted with concern the language around the increased migration that we have seen over the last few years, and we are all concerned to see the way in which criminal gangs exploit vulnerable migrants. Does he agree with me that by allowing the extraction of so much value from countries in Africa, we are not aiding and supporting the economic opportunities for Africans in their own country, and are therefore contributing towards increased migration?
Again, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. The lack of investment as a result of debt servicing does lead to people seeking other opportunities that are not available in their own country. So I totally agree with her on that point. Before I conclude, I want to thank CAFOD, Christian Aid, Debt Justice, UNICEF and Save the Children on their excellent briefings ahead of this debate and for their support in relation to debt cancellation. So I'll conclude by asking the Minister, will the Government support my 10-minute rule bill compelling private creditors from being able to sue for enforcement in the UK courts for more than has been agreed in debt relief with bilateral and multilateral lenders? And does she agree that there should be comparable treatment for all creditors? Also, does the Government support a public global debt register for transparency? And does she support the reform of the governance of institutions like the IMF who set the terms and conditions of bailouts? The UK has a unique position in being able to use its global reputation to bring about change on the international stage on debt cancellation, as it did 25 years ago. We led the way then, and it's time to do so again. We cannot afford not to. The Global South are looking to us for action, and it's time for us to act.
Remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in this debate. The question is that this House has considered debt cancellation for low-income countries. Jim Shannon.
Madam Chair, can I say what a pleasure it is again to serve under your chairship, and can I commend the honourable gentleman for Southgate and Wood Green for leading today's debate on this issue. I was speaking to him beforehand. The honourable member told me that he had a debate 2 weeks ago. I had the debate last week on a Thursday. He's a debate today, this Thursday. I have a debate this today, next Thursday at the same time. So I think the honourable gentleman and I are competing for the graveyard shift on a Thursday afternoon. Now, I don't know where we are, 2 each, I think that is, or maybe it's going to be exceeded, I'm not quite sure, but look, well done. It's a subject matter that we're all interested in, and that's why we're all here. Can I first of all say what a pleasure it is to see the Minister in her place. I wish her well in the role she now plays, and we look forward very much to the Honourable Lady's response on a matter which I know that the Honourable Lady is close to her heart, and I'm quite confident that when it comes to the replies that the Honourable Lady will do her best to try and encourage us all on where we are. Also, can I wish the Shadow Minister well, Madam Chair. I think he's newly appointed, I suspect. I hope I'm right in that. I think I am, and I wish him well in the role that he plays as well as we move forward. The United Kingdom have been involved in various initiatives aimed at providing debt relief for low-income countries over all of the years, including for countries like Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. We continue as a country, which is something we should be proud of, by the way, to work alongside LICs to ease pressure. And many will know that economically we are known for our generosity for other countries, and we'll always do our best to support. So I believe it's a real pleasure to be here to discuss that. Indeed, Northern Ireland as a region, Madam Chair, you'll probably know this, is one of the largest charitable regions when it comes to giving. And I'm not saying we're better than anybody else, but we are generous when it comes to charitable giving, and I just want to put that on the record as well. In December 2024, the World Bank warned that developing countries spent a record £1.4 trillion. My goodness, yeah, that slips off your tongue quite easily. But the fact is, it's £1.4 trillion, massive amount of money to service their foreign debts in 2023, which is astronomical. And interest rates rose to the 20-year high. Furthermore, the World Bank concluded that 38 low-income countries are in debt distress, and those are mostly in Africa and in Asia. Debt cancellation is a reserved UK-wide policy and does apply directly to the devolved institutions as a devolved matter. But Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales contribute to the UK's foreign aid and international development budget, and that largely includes the debt relief initiatives for the LICs. In addition to this, the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network have advocated long-term for the UK's involvement for providing debt relief to countries with struggling high financial burdens. Maybe, if you don't mind, can I ask, the Minister had the opportunity to have any involvement or discussions with the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network? They are a good organisation, do some great work, and if possible, it always encourages them, if you don't mind me saying that, Madam Chair, if the Minister here has had discussions and engagement with them. It's also perhaps very interesting, Madam Deputy Speaker, to look at the root cause of debt cancellation, and the sad reality is that for many countries such as Africa, the reasoning is poverty. And it's as simple as that, and as graphic as that, and as real as that. Poverty in Africa is a long-term, complex issue that impacts millions of lives every day. Political instability, uneven distribution of natural and government resources, sometimes corruption, and climate change all contribute to this issue. Those who are most affected are often those in rural and remote areas. And there are incredible charities out there, and I think the Honourable Gentleman mentioned some of the charities that contribute on a regular basis. But I want to, if I can, Madam Chair, just speak about some of the charities that contribute, not charities, church groups that contribute to through the NGOs, through their missions. I think, first of all, of Elam missions. Every year I'm very fortunate, Madam Chair, to have engagement with those from Swaziland. There's children's choir, young people's choir comes over, and they do some fundraising when they're in our constituency. And we do our best to help them and support them in every way we can. Every one of those children in that choir have got AIDS because their parents passed it on to them. But they are fortunate to have the HIV and the drugs that help them. And even with those disabilities, their voices are something special. So I think of the Elim Church Missions. I think of the and the constituency of Strangford. There's so many of them. I'll just name all the churches. Maybe the best way of doing it: Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian, the Methodist, the Roman Catholic, Baptist churches as well, and then there's other independent churches which contribute greatly. And you see that massive volunteer Christian faith-based energy to support projects in Africa. I think of the Elim one just in particular, just to mention it, because I have an engagement with them every year whenever they come to Northern Ireland. They provide schooling, they provide health, they provide work initiatives, and the charity do so much. And what it does, it prepares them for life, for jobs. It prepares them for life, whether it be on the farm, as a doctor or a teacher or whatever it may be. And they give them the opportunity to know how to sow the seed, to reap the crops so that they can live as well. And then when they come to Northern Ireland, you see their smiles, Madam Chair, you can't help to be lifted individually when you see what happens. So that's just some of the people, along with all the other charities, and many more that the Honourable Gentleman has spoken about, and others will speak of as well. I have no doubt that each one of us could name other ones apart from that, that work beyond relief, provide aid, support to these communities at a local level. But in the conversation of debt relief, these policies come straight from the government. So while they do all these things, and that's outside of government, the government here and the policymakers in this House, so that is of massive importance too at a very international level. Madam Chair, the UK has worked incredibly hard to introduce schemes that ultimately write off or suspend large debt from certain countries. For example, just 4 countries, and I think maybe the Honourable Gentleman, in fairness, mentioned them as well: Zambia, Ghana, Chad and Ethiopia have applied to the Common Framework, which is a follow-on from the Debt Service Suspension Initiative that was introduced in 2020. Thus far, an incredible 12.9 million in payments were suspended, which will go a massive way to easing pressure and providing a little more financial security for these countries who are struggling. And the reason why, as I said in my introduction earlier, is poverty. More often than not, poverty. It drives them. And when it comes to repaying, where's the tax coming from the government upon people who just are on such a poverty line they can't even pay tax? From 2001 to 2010, at least 49 low-income countries owing debts to the UK had all or parts of their debts forgiven. The total amount of debt owed to the UK is now US dollars, $1.8 billion. So there are calls currently for the UK to strengthen legislation on debt repayments. And I would hope that the Minister, I know the Minister will come back and give us some thoughts on how we as a government here can help them when it comes to debt repayments, to either compel private creditors to be involved in debt relief schemes, if that's possible as well. It's one of the options. On a final note too, Madam Chair, the Commons International Development Committee stated that the UK of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is uniquely placed, that's their opinion, I believe we are as well, to legislate because 45% of sovereign debts are governed under English law, which is a large amount. So we are able to legislate, I understand here. And would that be the Minister's intention to do that? If you don't mind me asking, and if we have the ability to do it, I understand we have, then I would suggest very respectably and humbly and kindly that we should. To conclude, Madam Chair, the scale of debt that is owed is huge, and we have done our bit recently to ensure fairness to other countries. And I thank the Minister and the Labour government and the Conservative government beforehand for all that they did. There's a huge impact that debt has on the development of LICs, and we must take that into consideration without forgetting that there are other means to which we can receive payments back. And is that an option when it comes to countries giving us something perhaps in kind, as an example, if that's possible? I look forward to hearing from the Minister and the Honourable Lady's plan to ensure that we protect LICs without putting the development of our own country at risk. Thank you.
Dr Jeevan Sander.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and to the Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green for bringing forward this debate. Today, African nations are facing a debt crisis caused by global factors, a debt crisis that is leading to more poverty, more hunger and war. Debt they cannot renegotiate because it is held by private lenders, each of whom, through no fault of their own, only have one incentive: to hold out for a better deal in the fiduciary duty of their shareholders. As that debt is issued in London, we can help private lenders break out of that trap by mandating that all of them must accept the outcome of debt negotiations. That will help us to end the African debt crisis, build functioning states and reduce extreme poverty, all without spending a penny. Now, before entering this place, Madam Chair, I used to work as an economist in the Finance Ministry of Somaliland, one of the poorest places on earth. I helped write their budgets, their economic policy and their national development plan. And I saw that to end extreme poverty, you need an effective government, as you've seen in India and in South Korea. A government that raises its own revenue is far more effective than one that resides and receives it in international aid, because with taxation comes representation. But, Madam Chair, African nations today are stuck, unable to reduce poverty because they're spending 1/5 of their revenue paying down debts, more than they spend on healthcare. They are trapped in that debt because of global factors. Firstly, the post-COVID supply shocks. Secondly, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And thirdly, rising global interest rates. Debt repayments up by 30% since 2019, more than tripled since 2010. African nations, like any debtor, now needs to renegotiate their debt. And if that debt was owed solely to other nations, it would be relatively simple. But it is not. It is instead owed to an unknown multitude of private creditors. Each of those creditors has a fiduciary duty to gain the highest return for their own shareholders. Each individual private lender is trapped. They have to hold out, let others take the haircut and try to gain the full amount for themselves. They are not bad people, they are not evil, they are simply trapped within a system within which no individual has the power to break out of. That is the power we can give them today. That is because 90% of African debt is governed by the common framework, is issued under England's legal jurisdiction. Now, we can help end the debt crisis without spending a penny by changing British law so that private lenders would have to abide by the outcome of debt negotiations. Where before private lenders were trapped, damned if they did forgive and damned if they don't, they would now be free to implement sensible debt renegotiations. Now, Madam Chair, I know that some will disagree, and I will take those arguments head on. Some will say the status quo, like collective action clauses, are sufficient. That view is wrong. Ghana and Zambia waiting 12 months for private lenders to come to the table. They are still waiting. Chaldean private debt is not owed in bonds, meaning they are not governed by CACs. The current system is not fit for purpose. Now, others will say that these reforms will mean that debt will no longer be issued in London. And if that were true, it should have happened after we passed the Debt Relief Act of 2010. Madam Chair, it did not. Nations do not lend here, seek to have their borrowing issued here because we have weak legal protections. It is because we have the strongest and deepest legal system in the world with centuries of case law. That is why, as the member for Oxford East has pointed out this week, 95% of African bonds are issued in England and Wales. This solution can work, and that is why the IMF and the World Bank support it. Now, I was an economist working in one of the poorest nations on earth during their worst drought in living memory. And yes, I saw people starve, but I also saw a nation being built from its own revenues, a nation making budgets, implementing policies. A state that could end extreme poverty was and is in the making in Somaliland. That nation saw our economy grow by 16% in real terms in 2012 and 2020, despite a global pandemic. And that reduction in poverty is about more than numbers. It means fewer people scratching around in the dirt, desperately hoping that something will grow so they could feed their children. That is what ending extreme poverty means. And we can end extreme poverty. Now, when my father was born into rural poverty in India, he had a 1 in 4 chance of dying before his 5th birthday, and 70% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, a child born in the same place is 10 times less likely to die. Only 1 in 10 of the world's people now live in extreme poverty. We can end extreme poverty in the years to come. And we can do so by changing British law to end this debt crisis. We can live up to and indeed continue the legacy of the former members of Dunfermline East and Sedgefield, who helped to cancel £30 billion of debt in 2005. Giving African nations the ability to use their own revenues, build their own governments, and create nations that can end poverty. That is what we can do by making sure that private lenders can and must participate in debt renegotiations. We, in this place, can help end extreme poverty for free. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Brian Matthew.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms McVeigh, it's a pleasure to be in this debate. This debate is extremely timely, and I commend the proposer, the member for Southgate and Wood Green, for organising it so that we can speak on this vital topic. As everyone here is likely aware, we're facing the most acute debt crisis in history. According to CAFOD, over 3.3 billion people living in countries where they're forced to spend more on debt servicing than on providing for their citizens. These high debt servicing costs prevent those countries from spending on vital public services such as education, health, and investing in SDGs. Private lenders make up the largest group of creditors, with many based in the UK and 90% of their contracts governed by English law. Many will be aware that this year, 2025, has been declared by Pope Francis to be a Jubilee year. And it's 25 years since the last Jubilee debt forgiveness, known as Jubilee 2000, when 40 countries called for the cancellation of Third World debt. Biblically, an important part of the Jubilee celebration was the cancellation of debts in order to give those in need a fresh start. We're told in the Bible not to be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards others, but instead to be open-hearted and freely give what is needed. For this Jubilee year, Pope Francis has made debt cancellation a priority, stating that it is more than a question of generosity, this is a matter of justice. We must act now to end the vicious cycle these countries are trapped in, as without being able to invest in development, countries are unable to grow their economies or fully escape debt. Furthermore, while in debt distress, countries may look towards quick solutions that involve exploiting or exporting their natural resources to do so, fossil fuels, mining or logging, and in the process worsening climate change, which disproportionately affects those in the global south, but also affects us here at home. The UK has a significant role to play in the solution to this problem. We've heard 45% of all foreign sovereign debt is governed under English law. The government has promised to tackle unsustainable debt and must hold private lenders and creditors accountable for this. Furthermore, the previous government cut international aid from 0.7 to 0.5% of gross national income, an act that withheld billions from those most in need. We must restore our aid spending to what it was before, as well as restore our leadership in the field of international development, and in doing so, restore our reputation as a kind and generous nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship. I want to start by commending my honourable friend, the member for Southgate and Wood Green, for bringing this very crucial debate and for his continuous campaigning on this matter. Now, I chair the APPG on African reparations, and I've long called on the UK government to engage in discussions around reparative justice. And I've said time and time again that the issue of reparative justice is about just that, justice. It's about more than handing over money. It's about addressing the structural inequalities that colonialism created and still perpetuates, changing those global structures that keep the global south in the situation it is. And those inequalities have been instrumental in creating the debt that we're discussing today. It's about addressing disparities that are starkly evident in the fight against climate change, particularly in the context of our international financial system, which is quite frankly a relic of the 20th century. Worsening droughts in East Africa and tropical hurricanes in the Caribbean, tsunamis in Asia show how Britain's former colonies remain disproportionately vulnerable to the frontline effects of crises that they did little to cause. Not only did we engage in colonial crimes, we remain a leading historic emitter. The UK could take responsibility by reframing reparative justice within the context of climate justice. We could fund large-scale restoration projects, compensate for biodiversity loss, and help nations to adapt to climate change. This form of reparative justice could be removing the burden of debt that is preventing these countries from fighting the climate emergency themselves by building infrastructure to defend against some of the environmental challenges which, if we do not get our act together, will be permanent. Some of the world's poorest and most climate vulnerable countries are seeing their debt payments grow twice as fast as their climate support. They do not currently stand a chance. And when faced with extreme weather conditions, yearly deathly floods or droughts, they are forced to borrow more and more to support their people and rebuild their infrastructure, adding to the already insurmountable debt pile. In 2022, I joined a parliamentary delegation to Kenya with CAFOD and saw firsthand the impact of famine and drought on the people living in Marsabit County. Their agriculture and their livestock were decimated. The country had been decimated by one of the worst droughts in living memory. The situation that we all saw on the ground in Kenya brought home the devastating ramifications of the climate crisis and the inequities that it is rooted in, inequities that we benefited from and have sustained since. Kenya is not a notable emitter of CO2. It does not drastically contribute to the climate destruction. In fact, Kenya is responsible for just 0.03% of global carbon dioxide emissions to date, and about 160 times less than the United Kingdom. And yet man-made climate change, of which the UK has historic responsibility for, is causing untold levels of destruction in that nation. And their debt crisis means that they, like many other countries that we've heard mentioned today, are unable to take meaningful steps to address it. In 2021, Kenya's debt repayments were more than 5 times the amount of money the government was spending on measures to tackle their climate crisis. They, like many other countries, are fighting this crisis with both hands tied behind their back. Countries in the global south will face an estimated $290 to $580 billion in climate-related loss and damage every year by 2030. Every single year. Now, at the start of the COVID pandemic, the G20 agreed a scheme to suspend debt payments for over 70 countries. But because private lenders were not made to participate on equal terms, countries that applied to the scheme had under a quarter of external debt payments suspended. As you've heard my honourable friends mention today, over 90% of the bonds owned by countries eligible for debt relief under G20 schemes are governed by English law. It means that they are under our control and we can actually do something about it. The UK could be playing a leading role in addressing the debt crisis instead of standing by as private creditors are bailed out. The government should be supporting efforts to cancel debts for all climate vulnerable countries with unsustainable debts by expanding the G20 common framework to include middle income nations and strengthen it to make sure that private creditors participate because we know, to be quite frank, that the situation for the average person in some so-called middle income nations is still dire. I also call on the government to enhance the UK's commitment on international climate finance overall and encourage other countries to do the same through a comprehensive financing facility to offer unconditional grants, not more debt, to countries facing climate disaster. And actually to push for automatic debt payment suspension and relief for countries in the event of a climate-related disaster and introduce legislation to stop private creditors from suing those same climate-vulnerable countries. The UK's role as a major historic emitter, a former colonial power and current global leader places a special obligation on us to put climate justice at the heart of our global response to the disaster we face now. And some people ask why reparative justice and not simply aid, and that is because aid has not worked. And when a duty is put on people to do something, when they understand that they owe somebody something and it is a matter of justice, they are more likely to do it. And aid has become an industry. Aid in itself is something that is subject to supply and demand, and so many countries are not benefiting from it in the way that they should be. So we need to look at this as an issue of reparative justice, and we, the UK, have to pay what we owe.
Yeah.
Now moving to the front bench, we'll have the opposition Lib Dem spokesperson, Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to express my thanks to the Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green for bringing this important issue to the House, and I want to praise his work on raising awareness of this issue. For decades, many low-income nations have struggled under the weight of unsustainable debt, spending billions servicing debt which prevents them from addressing the needs of their people or responding to the climate emergency, threatening a wave of political instability. It also prevents them from long-term investment in healthcare, education and infrastructure, the essential pillars of progress and stability. Lower-income countries have been facing increasingly unsustainable debts since the 2008 financial crisis, with debt payments increasing by over 200% between 2010 and this year, reaching their highest level since the mid-1990s. This is no surprise when we consider the combination of the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the global monetary tightening that has exposed vulnerable economies to insurmountable debt challenges as private capital inflows stopped and sovereign defaults ensued for already vulnerable frontier communities. The Liberal Democrats were the first to call for debt cancellation and have been calling for faster and stronger action on the global debt crisis ever since, because the case for debt cancellation is clear. It provides immediate relief, allows governments to prioritise social investment, fosters long-term economic growth, and over the long term allows those countries to become less reliant on overseas development assistance from countries like the UK. History has shown that when debt relief is granted, countries are able to improve public services, reduce poverty, and achieve sustainable development goals. But when countries are crushed by debt, it leads to instability, mass migration crises that end up here, and economic stagnation that affects us all. Faster and stronger action on this debt crisis is particularly important in Africa. In 2023, African countries spent over 50 times more on external debt than they received in aid from the UK, and 50% more than the total aid to the region, which is why we are clear in our support, aligning the UK with the African Union's push for full debt cancellation. The current mechanism for debt cancellation via the Common Framework has been too slow in its progress of cases, with only 4 countries having applied, Only 3 reaching agreements, Zambia, Ghana and Chad, and Ethiopia still in talks. Clearly, the government must improve on these mechanisms, and I note the International Development Committee 2023 report on debt cancellation for low-income countries made recommendations for the previous government, but many of these remain outstanding, and I hope these will be addressed by the Minister today. Specifically, I hope the upcoming development review the FCDO is conducting will focus closely on the critical interplay of that between debt and development in its strategy. This is absolutely essential because this Labour government has now presided over a further real terms cut to the ODA budget, even lower than the last Conservative administration. Under this government, an absolute cut in the level of support being provided to the world's poorest compared to the previous Conservative government. Therefore, low-income countries have been put between a rock and a hard place for too long, forced to service ever-increasing debts with less and less overseas development assistance from the likes of the UK, and now, of course, it seems the US, which compels these countries to service debt rather than to aid the most vulnerable people in their countries, which plunges these nations into further poverty. I sincerely hope the Minister can reassure us today in this debate that the government will return to 0.7% of GNI spent on ODA, and that the news, for example, that there will be no new funding at the Nutrition for Growth Summit this month is not a harbinger of the trajectory for the government in its spend on international aid, and the UK will return to its role leading on international development, particularly with the apparent retreat of the USA, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's points on this shortly. I'll draw to a close by re-emphasising that although the UK's ability to act independently is limited by international agreements, the UK does have significant influence over debt restructuring, with 45% of all sovereign debts governed by English law. So I look forward to hearing how the government intends to strengthen the common framework, address the root causes of debt accumulation, including unfair trade policies, exploitative lending practices, and the lack of financial transparency. It is time for a new financial framework that prevents the cycle of debt dependency from continuing, and for Britain to restate its commitments to the world's poorest. Thank you, Chair.
Good speech.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time as a Shadow Minister. I'd also like to commend the Honourable Member for Wood Green and... Sorry, it's Southgate and Wood Green. The constituency names have changed. But I've always known the Honourable Member as the member for Enfield Southgate. But he spoke with real passion today. And he brings with him knowledge and expertise about a topic which I think we all need to focus on more carefully. This is a very sensitive issue, and we need to ensure that we get it right. It shouldn't be a party political issue. We should be looking for solutions. And I think today's debate has contributed to that important discussion. So I thank the Honourable Member for bringing this debate to the floor of the House today. Ms McVeigh, Britain is a nation that has always been known for its Christian compassion, and that has been mentioned in other contributions in the debate this afternoon. But at the same time, we have always advocated the principle of helping others to be able to help themselves as the best pathway to providing long-term sustainability, particularly for developing nations. Many of those nations have been mentioned today in the contributions that have been made. So many contributions today have been very powerful, particularly, if I may say, the member for Loughborough, who spoke about Somaliland. And that I met Representative Somaliland recently, and I think it's so important that we use our knowledge and our expertise to help developing countries develop the type of economy that will generate wealth and prosperity, and that having these debts around their necks isn't always going to help them get out of that problem and become prosperous in the future. So he's used his expertise for that, so I commend him on that. Others have spoken about things like colonialism. Now, I'm not convinced that the member for Clapham and Brixton Hill should focus on that, to be frank. I think that we have other things more unifying that we should be talking about. Britain can lead the way in this if we get it right. If we start talking about the wrongs of Britain in the past, and they are subjective, there's a lot of good things that Britain has done. If we tie everything to colonialism, I think that's a divisive route to go down. So let's try and look at solutions. Let's try and advocate ideas that will bring a way forward on this rather than create political division. Of course I will, yes.
Way. And I would say that it's not necessarily a divisive issue. If you ask those who are suffering the most from these matters, you will find that they do actually believe that some of the wrongs that have been done to them in the past are the reason why it's more difficult to move forward. It's simply a recognition of it and looking at ways in which we can tackle this, and also recompense for the wrong that we've done, not being divisive, just accepting what went wrong and understanding that we have a duty to make it right.
Yes, so we
for low-income countries.
We won't focus too much on this, but I do respect the points the honourable member is making. But I have to say, she did say we should pay what we owe. Well, look, there are all kinds of arguments you can put forward about what we owe, but it's a matter of opinion. What I think we should do today is to bring unity and to look for solutions rather than to make this a political issue. And that is what I think we can achieve more for the developing countries if we work together rather than look at history where things have gone wrong or gone right and who may owe what, depending on what's going on in the world today. I don't think that's going to get us very far. So I think we should move on from that and focus on how we restructure the way debt is repaid, how we look at a better system globally to deal with this, rather than to look too far back into history. And it has been clear to me, right from my first time of standing as a Member of Parliament, that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And this has been confirmed today by the passion in the debate today, hearing all honourable members speak. Debt relief is an issue that deserves serious consideration, and we on this side of the House recognise that very much. Unsustainable debt burdens can be huge and significant impediments to economic development and growth, trapping nations into a cycle of poverty. However, I believe we must approach this matter in a responsible way, with both caution and pragmatism. Debt relief, if pursued, must be conditional, and it must be tied to a strong policy of fiscal responsibility measures. So I hope the Minister later on will provide assurances that any recipient countries will be expected to implement sound economic policies, tackle corruption and take steps to prevent future over-borrowing. Without these safeguards, I don't think the Minister can disagree that we risk creating a system in which financial mismanagement in perpetuity, almost, it seems never-ending, and rewarding the expense of responsible governance is what we should be focusing on. The hard-pressed British taxpayer footing the bill is not acceptable to most of our constituents. We need solutions. We need to solve these issues and not just see it as a one-way street. If the United Kingdom's taxpayers' money is involved, I'd like the government to tell us how they will ensure that such relief also serves the interests of the British people. During these difficult economic times, we must justify every single penny spent by government and always be mindful that it is our constituents' money and not the government's. Debt relief must not become an open-ended commitment, but rather a strategic tool, strengthening bilateral ties and ensuring geopolitical stability. So, I hope when the Minister speaks later, she can tell us how the government intends to prioritise sustainable development and what mechanisms are in place to monitor this going forward. I also hope the Minister will agree with me that the focus should be on not on perpetual aid or a blanket debt forgiveness, but on fostering economic self-sufficiency. That is, I believe, the only sustainable way forward. We must also consider how we, the United Kingdom, can play a meaningful part in helping low-income countries develop their domestic industries, improve resource management, and reduce their reliance on foreign debt. Without these structural changes, will the Minister tell us if debt relief would simply serve as a temporary fix, or would she prefer to have a system that is a sustainable solution, which is what we on this side of the House want to see? Certainly, yes.
I never wish to be in any way other than supportive of what the Honourable Gentleman said, but some of us in the House, indeed all of us in the House who have spoken so far, have mentioned about the charities, about the groups who make contributions, who fill the gap sometimes, Madam Chair, if I could say that. And I'm just wondering at some stage, if you don't mind me asking, very respectively, of course, maybe some recognition could be given to those groups.
Yes, I think the member for Strangford touched on this in his speech earlier, and others did as well. In fact, the member for Melksham and Devizes is another new name of a constituency. Chippingham, I think. Is that part of your constituency? No, it's not. It's that part of the world, Wiltshire. Anyway, great part of the world, but many churches, many faith organisations, not just Christian but others as well, do a huge amount in all of our constituencies to help raise funds, to alleviate poverty, and certainly in my constituency, churches and the Christian organisations take the lead in this. And it's a wonderful thing. And I would also add to this that if we are going to alleviate world poverty and deal with the question of restructuring international debt, this has to be a collective thing. It isn't just governments. It has to be other sectors that must be involved in these discussions. And certainly in terms of poverty alleviation, we have to all give credit to the charities, church organisations and faith groups and other parts of the voluntary sector that raise money week in, week out to help alleviate poverty and disaster relief in different parts of the world. And I think as members of Parliament, we all know that from our constituents. So I commend the Honourable Member for some of the, and all members, for their charities and their churches and their organisations and their constituencies that do that incredible work. So I'd also like to say that in terms of the geopolitical dimension, this is something we simply can't ignore. So the People's Republic of China, the Belt and Road Initiative, that has created debt dependency, threatening many sovereign nations around the world. And so will the Minister tell the House how the government intends to counterbalance Beijing's influence and provide a credible alternative to Chinese financing, which is of great concern? And so will debt relief and Belt and Road Initiative feature in the government's China audit? Perhaps she can answer that later on. Can the Minister also confirm to the House that any UK-backed debt restructuring would promote transparency, fair economic partnerships and long-term stability? Beyond individual cases, will the government tell us how they plan to advocate for more responsible lending and borrowing practices that ensure relief leads to lasting improvements rather than a repeated crisis? Does the Minister also accept that we should be looking beyond debt cancellation and focusing on investment incentives, infrastructure partnerships and trade agreements that enable these countries to generate revenue and pay their debts? So, how will the government ensure that its approach fosters economic growth rather than fostering continued reliance on external assistance? Ms McVeigh, it is crucial that any policy pursued by His Majesty's government is both effective and responsible. Debt relief, when structured correctly, can be a force for good, but it must be part of a broader strategy that promotes economic resilience, accountability and sustainable development. The government must navigate these challenges while always ensuring that British interests remain protected.
Minister.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time, I'm sure not the last, so thank you very much. I wanted to start my contribution by saying thank you to the Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green for drawing attention to these issues and bringing this debate on debt cancellation to the House today, to Westminster Hall. I would also like to thank the other honourable members of the House whose speeches have made for a very rich discussion about this issue. I'll mention these briefly, and I hope to come to everyone's questions, should time allow. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Strangford for his kind words about my appointment. I'm still very early on in my role, in my time in this role, so thank him for that. And also for underlining the importance of the role of charities in the development work that they do in low-income and vulnerable countries. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Loughborough, who spoke with great passion about his experience working in Somaliland, and he brings great insights to this House, having worked in that capacity previously. I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for Melksham and Devizes, and indeed the honourable member for Esher and Walton, for stressing that the UK needs to restore our leadership on international development. And I will come to some of their questions later on in my contribution. I'd also like to thank my honourable friend for Clapham and Brixton Hill for raising very crucial points about the situation that low-income countries, many low-income countries who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, find themselves in, and I'll say a little bit more about that too. But by way of introduction, this government is highly concerned by the debt challenges faced by many low and middle income countries, with 3.3 billion people living in countries spending more on servicing their debt than on health and education. This was a point made by many honourable members in this debate. Amongst low-income countries, 10 countries are currently in debt distress and 25 are at high risk, and there's an urgent need to address these vulnerabilities. As a government, we're fully committed to tackling unsustainable debt burdens in a way that supports development needs and helps countries address these vulnerabilities. And we're acting in three key ways, and I will try and attempt to answer the questions, particularly from my honourable friend who brought this debate, in going through these three key ways. The first is addressing liquidity challenges. The second is ensuring effective debt restructuring. And the third is promoting debt resilience. So let me first turn to the first, addressing liquidity challenges. We are working with international partners to address immediate liquidity pressures facing many countries, which are crowding out vital spending on climate, health and education. We support the IMF and World Bank's three-pillar approach, which is designed to support countries with high debt repayments. The first pillar is focused on action for vulnerable countries to improve revenue mobilisation and implement sound economic policies. The second focuses on ensuring countries are receiving new flows of finance at concessional rates from international financial institutions and other development partners. The final pillar looks at providing case-by-case action to reduce the cost of existing debt burdens where needed. Second, we are working to address debt vulnerabilities through improving the effectiveness of debt restructuring for countries in debt distress. The G20 Common Framework remains, we believe, the best mechanism for coordinating debt restructurings to address unsustainable debt burdens, but further progress is needed. The UK is working closely with the G20 and other international partners to ensure the framework delivers more timely, orderly and predictable debt restructurings. I know this is high on the priority list of the South African G20 presidency this year, and the UK will be pressing for rapid implementation of the lessons learned from the Common Framework, which were agreed under the Brazilian presidency of the G20 last year. The private sector, and this has been mentioned by many honourable members, must also play its part in debt restructuring efforts. We are actively engaging with private sector partners, for example, through the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, to ensure continued private sector support for addressing the debt challenges faced by these countries, leveraging the City of London's leading role in the sovereign debt markets. Now, I want to turn to some of the issues that have been raised by my honourable friend and indeed other members. A number of members, including my honourable friend, mentioned the issue of private creditors and whether we needed legislation to force them to participate. The government is not currently seeing evidence that private creditors are refusing to participate in debt restructurings. Recently, private bondholders have agreed to debt treatments for common framework countries, including Zambia and Ghana. We are working closely with the private sector through bilateral meetings, engagement with representative institutions, and the Paris Club, and indeed in Paris Club's discussions. Other honourable members also raised this issue of comparable treatment by private creditors. So in response to that, I would reiterate that both Zambia and Ghana have reached agreements on debt restructurings with their private bondholders. Official creditors have deemed these comparable to their own restructurings. The honourable member for Southgate and Wood Green also raised the need for UK leadership on debt relief, and this is something that we heard from others too. I would highlight that the UK has a strong track record of pushing for effective and holistic solutions to debt challenges, including supporting the IMF's three-pillar approach, which I've already mentioned, for countries facing liquidity challenges, and pushing for more effective cooperation and coordination under the G20's common framework. The UK also coordinates debt treatment through our membership of the Paris Club and our commitments to the G20 common framework, working in partnership with other creditors. Unilaterally writing off debt owed to the UK, and this is a key point, would not be in the interests of the UK taxpayer. The Shadow Minister mentioned the UK taxpayer, of course, which would be subsidising ongoing payments to other creditors if done unilaterally. The government is therefore working closely with borrowers, officials and private creditors and the IMF and World Bank to strengthen the wider debt architecture and provide timely and coordinated restructurings for countries where needed to support holistic debt sustainability for low-income countries. The third way that the government is pursuing this issue is that we are tackling unsustainable debt by promoting greater resilience in debt markets. The UK is committed to providing sovereign financing on sustainable terms, and that is in response to some of the points raised by the Shadow Minister, and to acting in an open and transparent manner to support global debt sustainability. We are playing a leadership role internationally in several key ways, and this, the members for, I believe, let me get my constituencies right, Melksham and Devizes and Esh and Walton particularly asked what the UK was doing to provide leadership. So let me say something about this. I will give one.
My contribution, not that it's better than anybody else's, but just I'd given forward the idea of perhaps maybe the countries that we're helping for debt, they might be able to supply us with some goods as a way of paying back rather than a financial repayment. Is that something that maybe the Minister and Government could look at? Just asking the question, please.
I'm not sure that is something that we're actively considering, but I will take that back and check and write to him if that's okay. In December last year, we were the first country to publish our self-assessment against the G20's operational guidelines for sustainable financing. In line with those guidelines, we publish annual reports on the total stock of debt owed to the UK, including reports on our new sovereign lending transactions. Finally, we are committed to provide sovereign financing on sustainable terms, adhering to the OECD's sustainable lending principles. The Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green also suggested creating a private sector transparency register. The UK supports all initiatives to improve debt transparency and is open to considering proposals for such a register. We also acknowledge the ongoing work by Georgetown University in this area. The UK has also led the way in promoting debt resilience through the introduction of contractual innovations, an approach that the IMF has found is working well. Under our G7 presidency in 2021, the UK developed 2 contractual innovations together with private sector stakeholders. And the first relates to external shocks that the Honourable Member mentioned in his speech. First, climate-resilient debt clauses help to strengthen resilience of vulnerable countries by suspending debt repayments in the wake of external shocks, which frees up fiscal space for the country. The UK has led the way by including CRDCs in our own lending and calling for all lenders to adopt CRDCs by the end of this year. Second, the UK helped develop majority voting provisions, which are for use by the private sector, specifically for syndicated lending. MVPs allow a majority of creditors to bind the minority to the terms of a restructuring, thereby mitigating the risk of a minority of creditors holding out in a restructuring scenario, which is something that honourable members mentioned in their contributions, and enabling more efficient debt restructuring processes. On Monday, at her speech at the London Stock Exchange, my right honourable friend, the Minister for Development and member for Oxford East, announced that the FCDO will provide technical assistance for borrower countries that intend to include majority voting provisions in their contractual agreements with private sector lenders. Now, let me turn to a couple of the questions that were asked during the debate that I have not yet got to, and I apologise if I don't get to all the questions in the time I have available, and promise to write to honourable members if I don't get to all of them. So let me just turn to my honourable friend for Southgate and Wood Green again. He asked about the reforming the governance of international organisations. We agree that more needs to be done. First, we must change the international financial system to deliver a fairer deal for developing countries, including using our board seats at the IMF and the World Bank for a bolder approach on unsustainable debt. Second, we need to make sure our system is more representative of those most in need. So we will make the case not only for fairer outcomes, but fairer representation in how we represent them. Turning to the Honourable Lady for Esher and Walton, the opposition spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. She asked whether the government would return to 0.7% of GDP on development, which is something that the last Labour government was very proud to indeed commit to and reach. The government remains committed to restoring ODA spending to 0.7% as soon as fiscal circumstances allow. Whilst the OBR's forecasts show that these tests have not yet been met, we continue to monitor these forecasts closely and remain one of the top ODA providers in the G7. There was also a number of questions about climate, including from my honourable friend for Clapham and Brixton Hill. And I just wanted to make a few comments about that. So to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable countries and free up fiscal space when responding to shocks caused by climate change, the UK has led the way in encouraging the broader adoption of climate-resilient debt clauses, which suspend debt repayments on a cost-neutral basis in the wake of exogenous shocks. We welcome creditors who have committed to providing CRDCs and encourage others to follow suit. My honourable friend also for Clapham and Brixton Hill mentioned in her contribution that the common framework, she said, should be expanded to middle-income countries and should offer an automatic suspension for countries that apply for restructuring. The UK is fully committed to making the common framework a success. We support the expansion of the framework to middle-income countries and providing automatic debt standstills for countries that apply for restructuring under the framework. We continue to push for these reforms in the G20. I hope that answers her question on that point. Now, let me turn to the Shadow Minister and thank him for his contribution. I think this is the first time that we have debated across this way. So he asked about reassurance on sound economic policy and preventing corruption. We agree that any lending and policy must be agreed on a sustainable basis. First, the scale of debt treatments are set under the IMF's debt sustainability analysis. Second, the UK is committed to acting in an open and transparent way, as we have shown by publishing our own self-assessment against G20 guidelines. He also asked a number of questions. He was talking about open-ended commitments and sustainability. I think we all agree we want to reduce the reliance of low-income countries on foreign debt. That's what this debate is about, and we want a sustainable solution. He asked about the role of China specifically. I'm happy to write to him in follow-up to his questions on that, but all I would say is that it's really important that we work with all international partners on this issue, because only by working multilaterally will we have success in terms of providing sustainable solutions. We don't think we can act alone. Ms McVeigh, I would like to thank all honourable members for their thoughtful contributions during today's important debate. Together with the international community, we must work actively and urgently to address the significant debt challenges faced by vulnerable countries, and the government is committed to doing just that. Thank you.
To wind up.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh, and I will be brief in my comments. I very much welcome the Minister's responses, certainly in relation to financial institutions about reforming the IMF, particularly on representation and how they look at debt, and also in transparency. In relation to external shocks, I do think that we should look at automatic cancellation of debt when a country is facing a climate event, for example, and I very much hope that that's something that can be looked into long term. On the issue of comparable treatment, I know the Minister has taken that on board and will be looking into that further. I disagree with her in relation to legislation for private creditors. Private creditors have not shown themselves to be responsible in this way. I've given examples of private creditors who have not engaged in the G20 framework in the way they were expected to. If she does have regular meetings with them, I hope she's able to convey this to them. And until we see changes, I certainly will be pursuing legislation through my private member's bill. We've had a good discussion today, and I want to thank all members for contributing in the way they have done to show the unanimity in what they'd like to see done. I think we all support debt cancellation, and we'd like to see more done to help those low-income countries, the most vulnerable ones, get back on a level footing so they can actually develop their economies as we'd like to see them develop. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered debt cancellation for low-income countries. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.